Hi, welcome everyone. We'll wait as more people join us today, but we're very excited to have you on today's webinar about hybrid events. So welcome. We'll just give a few more minutes for everyone to join us. We want to make sure we can have everybody participate. Hi, while our panelists are, well, everyone's joining us and our panelists are coming on screen and unmuting. I want to welcome everyone. Today's an EVA virtual conference webinar. We love doing educational content and sharing that out with everyone out there in the world. And I'm very excited to have some of my favorite people joining me today. Brian Monahan with Prestige AV out of Cincinnati. Hi, Brian. Welcome. And then we've got Rebecca Takemoto here in the DC area with Syncopate Meetings.
Hi.
Hi, Rebecca. And Phil Rappoport, who is my partner in crime over at RHMP. Glad to have you, Phil.
Thank you, Vanu. Great to be here.
Phil is also with VirlyBird. So what is great is we recently had the opportunity to work together over at RHMP to put together a summer camp event. What was first supposed to be an in-person event slowly became a hybrid event. And the four of us, along with a host of a lot of other volunteers, were able to work together to make that happen. And we learned so much through the process, not only how we work together as suppliers and planners, but also just tips and tricks that made it really easy for us to transition to a hybrid environment. And we wanted to be able to share that with all of you today. So just before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. We do have everyone muted today, but if you have any questions or would like to ask your questions live, just let us know. Just raise your hand or ask your questions in the chat box. We're happy to help you. If you have any technical assistance that you need, definitely put that in chat box and we'll help you out. But let's get started. Oh, and today will be recorded. So if you want access to the recordings, we're happy to share that with you as well. So before we begin, we have a little poll that we want to ask you guys, just to kind of gauge where everybody is in the world of virtual and hybrid meetings. Let's get that poll up and out. Basically, tell us about your experience with hybrid events. Let's see, is that poll? As soon as we get that poll, I can tell you a little bit more what those questions and answers are going to be. We'll get that in a minute. Well, Rebecca, while we're getting that poll out, I know with hybrid events and with a lot of the clients that you're working with, I'm hoping that you're one of the first stops that people make, whether they're planning the hybrid event or a regular in-person event, that you're the first stop. When they come to you or you're working with a client that's considering this, what are some of the things that you're hearing, or how do you advise them through this process of do we, don't we? How do we go about this? What are you seeing?
So to start, I think best case they're talking to a planner first, right? But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And too often, I think we're brought in after major decisions have already been made. And I think that's probably true for independent planners like myself, and also for in-house planners. I've certainly talked to a lot of friends who are in-house planners that sort of get dropped a decision in their lap and aren't part of the conversation at the table. But that's a different subject we'll talk about another time. But my first piece of advice is bring, especially if you're going to outsource, bring them on as soon as possible. I think I could speak for every independent planner I know and state that we would be happy to have an exploratory conversation with a potential client, or even just somebody that had no idea what they were doing, just to kind of get those first questions out. And I have those conversations all the time, and sometimes they end up with new work, and sometimes just as often, maybe I talk them out of something. And I think any good independent is going to do that. None of us want work that isn't worth doing. But my initial conversation, the last 18 months, is just like it's always been, and is about goals. And I know that is my crazy soapbox, and Vanu and Phil are probably laughing at me because they're tired of hearing me say that. But it is so important, and it is so often forgotten. You have to have a real conversation about the organization's goals and why are you having this meeting? And the answer to that might be because we've had it for 40 years in a row. And that's okay. Get that out there and put it on a big old whiteboard, but have that conversation. What do you need to accomplish? Interestingly, this year, I have more clients who, when it really comes down to it, income is not their prime objective. Like, it's not the reason they're doing their meeting. But for some groups, it absolutely is. For some groups, the revenue generated from an annual conference, for instance, is funding many other projects, and that having a meeting at a loss is just not an option. But it's different for every group. So start with those goals and then look at what an in-person conference can do to accomplish those goals. And then look at what a virtual conference can do to accomplish those goals. And you'll pretty quickly see what the overall structure of your meeting should be. If it's all about content, like many medical meetings are, then it's about getting as much content out there as you can. If it's primarily about relationships, about networking, about, building cohesive groups or whatever, then, it's important to do a hybrid that is a true hybrid. So I just can't say it strongly enough. If you're skipping those initial strategic conversations, you are missing the boat. And I recognize that probably everybody on this call wants to have those strategic conversations, but it's sometimes going to be about you going into, whoever and just saying, we have to have this, you have to give me an hour of time of the big decision makers and really, have a strategic conversation, so that your hybrid plan can be a proactive plan and not just a reaction. I think that's my biggest thing I've learned.
Yeah. And, in the best case scenario, right, we have all the time in the world that we can take the time to step back and really think about that. And it's something that our industry has been going towards, of being more strategic about what we do. It's not just filling out the BEO and the AV requests and look at it invoices. It truly is about being strategic with programming, about content, about registration, about the experience. Brian,
so I want to put out, Vinu, sorry, Lori Haas just put in the chat, great idea to have those conversations, but what if the answer keeps changing? The answer does keep changing. That's why we have to keep having those conversations. If the answer is the same as it was 5 years ago, you're not asking the right questions. So I think keep having those conversations and make sure your plan has some good backup. We were talking just this, a little bit ago about how I think a lot of the reason some groups are doing hybrid, especially meetings this fall, is because they need a backup in hand, ready to go. And if it ends up needing to be a virtual meeting, and you've planned a hybrid meeting, then it's a much easier transition than if you were planning 100% in person and you have to go virtual.
Building that foundation is so important. It helps make those decisions in times of crisis a lot easier to make, especially when you're talking about an organization. And each department has different initiatives and goals and objectives. So it's kind of good to know going forward, this is what we need to accomplish. Brian, before I get to you, I did want to launch that poll. I'm hoping we can have that up for everyone to see. Maybe. Well, Brian, we're going on to you. Brian, I know that with this pandemic, every month is a different month, every day is a different day in terms of do we do in person, do we go to hybrid, do we go to virtual? And I'm thinking that you are one of the AV companies are one of the first people turn to, because you're already contracted, you already know the organization, you're already involved. When clients come to you and say, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What is your reaction? Well, how are you counseling them through this process?
Well, I think Rebecca hit on a great point. First, I'm going to disagree with Rebecca and say that obviously they should call us first, but then we'll get you in the mix right away. But no, actually, that's been the really neat thing about the past year for us as AV professionals. We did raise ourselves in the line. We get called much quicker, and technology is obviously the backbone of a lot of these hybrid experiences. So it makes sense that we're getting that call. And as Vinu, as you mentioned, we're also somebody that a lot of these organizations know and trust. And so they want to get the right information. They don't want to just gather it randomly off the internet. And so I think that that would be an important thing, is not necessarily that you're calling the AV company, but you're calling your trusted partners, the people who've been there for you. You want to get in touch with them, find out what the landscape of the business is right now. I think Rebecca hit a great point, which is the hybrid is not really an option to not plan right now. You have to expect disruptions. It may be out of your control. I do have some clients who say, we're going in person no matter what. And hopefully they're not listening today, but I think that is not a safe plan to say that I don't have a backup option. And yes, we can pivot, but I would recommend all clients to lead with a known virtual option that is at least in place, and you have some level of pivot that you can immediately go to without any work. And then you can build back in some complexity if you really do have to go virtual, but you're not building it from scratch. And that's what I would always recommend. Yeah. Another thing I would recommend is as we talked about who comes to the tables, I think the industry shifted in the sense is you don't want to build your budget on the backside of your plan. I think you want to start to bring your partners much earlier in the process. You shouldn't be months into your planning trying to figure out who you're going to hire. You should be bringing the person that you know you want to hire to the table so you can get down to those really solid details instead of leaving that to chance later in the game. So those are a few things I have to add to the mix right now.
And Catherine, I see you have a question here. What does hybrid mean to us? We will definitely be getting back into that conversation because hybrid means so many different things to so many people. And actually, it's a great segue to Phil. Phil, it's great what I see you doing with working with organizations, trying to figure out hybrid, virtual, and all these different combinations. When someone comes to you looking at all of that and looking at all these different options, where do you begin?
So thanks, Manu. So I serve as a consultant / agency for the client, for the organization that's hosting the meeting. And so like Rebecca was saying, it starts with the objectives. I'm actually doing it as an organizer or meeting planner might be interviewing me to see if I have the right tools to bring to them. I find that I'm interviewing them, and because I want to make sure there's a fit. Ultimately, it's got to be the right fit, because you have to stand. A good supplier or a partner is probably a better word, needs to be able to stand up and be truthful to you and be candid with you. So ultimately, I'm looking to see if I'm the right fit. And if I'm not, the first thing I'm going to do is recommend somebody who can help them. So in that process of discussion, I always go to, what's the purpose of the meeting? Take me through this from your eyes. And can you take me through this from the participants' eyes, from the attendees? Is this an education event? What is motivating people to come? Is it continuing education or something else, right? Is there networking and idea sharing? What makes this meeting conducive to that? And are sponsors driving this program, right? Are you trying to keep them happy and so that they have a way to get in front of your constituents, the participants? Then I go into kind of, well, tell me a little bit about the format or the structure. Is it a single day? Is it a multi-day? May I view your website? I'm doing my due diligence basically, so I can add value in the end. And who are the other vendors and partners in as much as I can help you. For example, I'm working on a hybrid right now. It's supposed to be in the Midwest in October, and some of you might chuckle, but some decisions were made before I came in. We're using 3 different platforms. I'm working with the AV provider, and I'm working with the planner. And so I'm in the mix because I can pull different things together, different technologies, different personalities. It's complicated, and what the client is looking for ultimately is a partner. They need someone by their side who will be with them for the planning process all the way to the end. So knowing the KPIs, how do you measure success? Is it just by sheer number of attendees? What needs to happen in this particular program? And ultimately that goes to whether or not we're going to work together. And typically it's a good experience, and it comes to fruition for a project. But these are really key things that I ask of the planner or the organizer to really help me understand what they're trying to achieve.
That's great. Now let's get back to what Catherine was asking about. What is hybrid? Curious. I know, Rebecca, you had an answer in there. What do you, can you expand a little bit more, Rebecca, for us about how do you see hybrid? How do you define that?
So as I said in the chat, for me, a hybrid meeting is one where there is both an in-person and a virtual component. And I said in my chat simultaneously, but as I think back, I don't know that I necessarily believe that, because I don't think the schedule has to be the same. I don't think, I do think some of the content needs to cross over, and some of the attendees, it's not really a hybrid if there isn't some crossover to me. There has to be some kind of integration, but often it's kind of two totally different meetings. And I think one of the takeaways I had from our Reston Herndon summer camp was Beth Sermont talked about how she hates that word hybrid, and she doesn't believe there's any, that's a thing, that there are two different meetings happening. And I mean, I think we could have a heated argument about that, but I do totally see where she's coming from, that, you do have to plan them somewhat separately and also together. I mean, for me, it's important. A live stream of a live conference is not a hybrid meeting. That is a live stream. That is, people can watch it remotely. That is different to me than a hybrid meeting, which literally has, some content that's only hybrid and that's only virtual, and some content that's only in person. And the most importantly, the attendees can mix in some way.
Right. I think it's really interesting to look at, even what do we define as a meeting, right? Is it just the one day? Is it several days? Is it an entire program? And I think now what's really great to see what's happening in a lot of organizations is it's no longer sits just in the meetings department, and there's more collaboration between meetings and programming and membership, and how does it all work together in different ways? Phil, have you seen some things, or I've worked on some things where those three departments are really working together and seeing that engagement, and how does that define your vision of what a hybrid is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think hybrid is a convenient term, right? It's just a convenient term that we're using right now, we being the meetings and events industry, for a program that can be delivered in two formats. One is in person and one is virtually. The virtual can include on demand. It could include, content that's, I'm working with another client that their on-demand content is actually going to be available through December, and their conference is in September. So I think it's different things to different people, as long as you're being true to your audience, and that you can deliver the best experience that you can in person and the best experience that you can virtually, digitally. And sometimes they'll overlap purposefully. Sometimes you'll be live streaming. And sometimes, as we might, if we have time a little bit later, talk about kind of where Rebecca was leading to, is that, focusing on the virtual audience as an audience, and, delivering content to them so that they can embrace your vision, they can embrace what you're doing. So I'm seeing a number of different executions falling under the quote unquote hybrid meeting format.
Yeah. Brian, before even the pandemic happened, I know that you were working with a lot of clients on streaming, whether it was streaming in and streaming out. Did you ever consider that hybrid at that point? And how's with everything that's happened in the last year? How's that different now for you?
Well, I think prior to the pandemic, people's vision of hybrid was pretty low. And like you said, it was streaming out. There wasn't a lot of two-way interaction. And I think, as we got locked down, we got creative. And I actually feel like this period was one of the best things that's happened to the meetings industry. It's allowed us to get these tools robust and enterprise class and reliable. And so a lot of these options people have wanted to do for 10 years, but nobody's been willing to slow down and make the products work, make all of the technology mishmash and become standardized. So I think it's been a great opportunity for the industry to advance. The tools are there. They have matured in under 14 months. And so I'm excited about the next 10 years. I think we can do a lot. One thing I want to say about hybrid, my differentiation on hybrid is I think hybrid's not a definition, it's a type. So it's a cheeseburger with lettuce and cheese and pickles. And so I want you, make it your way. So when you define hybrid doesn't define the event. Hybrid tells you that I need to define what I want in my event. Do I want a virtual stream? Do I want that stream to have two-way chat in it? Do I want to have two-way video communication, and then it's a conference? And do I want to have on-demand content? I think a lot of people forget about that even in today's world, that now on-demand content is actually a feature of an event, whereas before it was often kind of an afterthought. Or I have some clients doing the same thing. They're actually doing their in-person. We're going to capture all the sessions, and then they're going to be provided as a future on-demand environment that will be coupled with some conferences or webinars as well. So they're going to tie two products together later. So they're extending your content. And so my key point is I think you want to get clear about what your outcomes are. I don't know if anybody, I know the event design handbook, which does the event canvas, it's been around pre-pandemic, but I think it's a phenomenal tool to get clear about your stakeholders and make sure that you're delivering the best experience to them. And actually, Phil and I were involved with the MPI hybrid event, which was Reconnects. And we actually used the event canvas to rebuild that entire conference into a hybrid experience. And so it was very valuable just to slow down and ask, what does each stakeholder need and expect from the conference? So I recommend that tool.
And
See, Rebecca, it does come back to strategy that you've been talking about. It all does come down to knowing what your audience needs, wants, and how you want to deliver that.
Yeah, and I was just going to say there's been some interesting conversation happening in the chat, and I agree that hybrid is just a word that helps. It's just a term, and unfortunately, there is no glossary for these terms. I actually have started to try to create one because every client says different words for everything and it drives me crazy. But I think that, like Brian was talking about, okay, so you have this live conference and you record it and then you have the content for on demand later, or you put it with a webinar or whatever. That to me isn't a hybrid meeting. Not to say it's not right for some clients, like for some meetings, that's exactly what they need to do. So I don't want anybody to think that, me saying, I don't think that's called hybrid means that's wrong, by any means. It goes back to that initial conversation about goals and what do you need to get out of it. I think that creating and capturing content that you can use in lots of different ways. A lot of organizations need to monetize that content. A lot don't, whatever. But just for sake of understanding what everybody's talking about, I think that the idea of a hybrid conference is both of those audiences interacting or happening simultaneously. Not that it has to be the same, but just that, there are different things. And Vanu, just put in the back of your hat there to talk about pricing, because there's a lot of chat going on about that. And I think we should.
Absolutely. And I think that was a big concern for us. I definitely wanted to talk about our recent experience with RHMP. And for all of you that don't know RHMP, it's the Rest and Herndon Meeting Planners Group, founded 20 years ago by Margaret Leishman. And it is just an organic group that has just really flourished in this community and really supports one another in terms of education and networking and just sharing just great stories. So RHMP puts on a summer camp each year, with the exception of last year, and it's been the last few years. And this was our first foray into doing a hybrid situation. And Phil, can you talk to us a little bit? You're one of our key members of the steering committee. Talk to us a little bit about, making that decision of going from in-person to doing something that incorporated a virtual component.
Sure. So for those who might not be in the Washington DC area. So as Vanu was saying, Reston Herndon are close in suburbs of DC, and there's a whole community of organizations and associations that are based in the Northern Virginia corridor. So back in 2017, we took a poll of some of our folks. We used to have in-person, but pre-COVID, for many years, we had in-person meetings every other month. Essentially, we had breakfasts and a lot of people attended. And we asked people, would they come to like a half a day, a little bit more than just an hour to hear one speaker. And so they resoundingly said yes. And so we started back in 2017 with a half a day. That morphed into a full day. In 2019, we did another full day, and we had nearly 250 meeting professionals show up, mostly planners, looking for ideas and strategies and things like that. And so this year, we actually got to the decision a little bit late, kind of perfect. We were kind of just like trying to read the tea leaves and look at the coronavirus, the vaccination rates, et cetera. Fortunately, in the DC area, vaccination rates are much higher, relatively speaking, than elsewhere in the country. But we knew that we were doing virtual programs since the spring of 2020. So we were doing monthly or bi-monthly programs virtually. And there was a sense that, we missed each other. We missed seeing each other in person. And could we do this? Could we try it? So we were actually kind of being introspective, and many of our topics, many of the programs that we had over the course of a year and a half were focused on running virtual meetings, running hybrid meetings. And so we had to ask ourselves, are we ready to do our own? Are we ready to kind of walk the walk? And so having community at the core of what we do, because this is really about community. This is an important aspect of this particular organization. We decided about 3 to 4 months out to move forward with it. We already had a hotel lined up from the prior year, and they were very amenable to working with us and flexible. And the bottom line here is we wanted people to be comfortable regardless of how they wanted to participate. So we made it very clear up front in all of our marketing materials to them that we're going to do this. We kind of laid the groundwork. We're going to come back together. However, you can also enjoy this virtually or digitally. And I know Rebecca can actually talk even more specifically about the format that we did. And this wasn't your typical one-day conference with people shuffling through the hallways and going to their next breakout session. We actually gave it a lot of thought into the structure and the format of how we did it. So I guess I'm throwing it to Rebecca to maybe take us through there, and then Brian could actually come in and talk a little bit more about what decisions we made with regards to AV.
Yeah, so I think programming, again, we had that conversation about what we wanted to do and what our goals were. And our goals as a content committee were to be able to learn from each other. I mean, that really was the prime goal. We found that in all our conversations about programming, the recurring theme was, well, I learned from this other planner, or I read on the national Facebook page, or I blah, blah, blah. And we just really wanted to keep that going. I think all of us, I think everybody on this line, on this call had some experience, some additional experience this year with other planners than usual. And we learned from each other, and we borrowed from each other. Excuse me, and we shared with each other more than I have ever seen in 20 some odd years. So that was really our goal. So we set out to create a day of content that would be incorporate lots of different learning styles that would, again, really draw on the community learning. So we had a couple of kind of traditional speakers, but short TED Talk style. We had some just straight up roundtable discussion times, small group that then presented to the group, not unlike, a 7th grade history project. And we had some straight out, okay, I'm standing on the stage and I'm going to ask a question of all 100 of you. And then we just started conversations. And that was really important to us, but it also made it a little tricky in a hybrid scenario, because not all of those things lend themselves super well to a virtual environment. But that was another goal, was to be able to offer the content to those who couldn't join us live. And we had like 60 people or something that were on virtually. And so like, for instance, for the small group discussion things, they had breakout groups. And, for the larger discussions, we projected the Zoom on the screen behind us, and they were absolutely in the conversation. They would speak up and we could see them on the screen, and we had Vanu and Brian kind of behind the scenes making all the magic work so that it, looked good for everybody. And Phil, I think our little secondary stage was a super important part of that. So you need to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we can, maybe we have some photos here. And again, as people are looking and hearing us and kind of looking at some of the visuals, know that, I look at this as kind of a lab, this was not a 500 person, 1,000 person conference that many folks in the audience are dealing with. I get that. We looked at it truly as a lab and like, what can we do here? What can we we also set expectations very early on. I think, what Rebecca did in the meeting I wouldn't call it a keynote, I would say opening remarks that were streamed. So people in the room and people digitally could hear them, is we set the expectations. Here's what we're going to do today. Here's how we're going to do it. Go with us. Now you can't, maybe that doesn't hold water for every type of organization. And maybe people are very, more buttoned up and all that. But in this particular environment, people are coming in very casually. It was set up that way. Do we have any photos we can?
I can pull it up quick if
Mary?
that's helpful.
Yeah, we should be able to
Here we
pull
go.
those up.
So this is just an example of where the folks in the room are seeing that there are people who are part of this discussion. They're digitally represented here, and so they were able. So in part of our breakout sessions, we actually assigned facilitators who were gathering and sparking conversation and gathering information to report back to everyone, both in the room and digitally. So this was just one portion of our
And we
room.
had facilitators, just to add on to that. So we had facilitators dedicated for each table in the room, and then also a facilitator dedicated to each breakout room that was virtual, just to help. And those facilitators were identified in advance. People that we knew and trusted could actually, help the group go through a conversation and lead them to findings that can come back and report at the when we brought the virtual and the in-person meeting to people together.
And both, just to reiterate that, we had facilitators both in person and virtual when we broke out into groups. So we had Phil sort of acted as our overall virtual MC, and I was sort of the overall in-person MC. And then in our small group discussions, of course, we had people assigned to lead those discussions in both places. And I think that's really important. I think the next picture Tiffany's going to show here. Yeah, there we go. Talk about this a little bit, Phil.
So this was just in the reception area where we did live interviews specifically for the virtual or digital audience. We wanted people who are watching digitally to really feel like they were connected. So we brought people in both on the supplier side and just attendees. How's it going? What's your experience? It's funny, I spoke with somebody last night at an industry gathering, and she came in virtually for this particular event. And I was looking for constructive criticism. I typically am. I'm like, what didn't you like about it? What can we work on? And she goes, I really enjoyed it. She goes, one of the things I really enjoyed, and this is kind of where Brian comes in, is his company brought in a 360-degree Robo camera, I guess is what I'll call it, where it was able to rotate around the ballroom so that people virtually can actually really see people, not just speakers. They can actually see the audience. They can find and identify people they knew. She said she felt way more connected. So this shot just happens to be in the reception area. You can see the stage that we put in the riser Occasionally, I did wear a mask. I was very sensitive to that, or I would ask, and I would ask our presenters or guests if I could be unmasked and they could hear me. But this particular shot shows me without a mask. But we were very sensitive to that, and frankly, most people wore a mask at this event, except for when they were eating or drinking.
You know what, I think this just kind of brings it kind of what we've been talking about, Rebecca, with the strategy, thinking about what's important to the organization, what do we want to accomplish out of it? And in this case was that collaborative environment of learning and peer-led education. And then how do you make that happen with the programming? How do you cater to the in-person audience so that it's relevant and effective for them, as well as the people that are virtual as well. Now, Brian, from a technical standpoint, what are some of the things with a hybrid event like this? You know, and granted, Phil, I love how you put this, that this was a lab. There were so many things that we could experiment with and have people let us know their feedback as an attendee, as a planner, what was their reaction to this. But Brian, from a technical standpoint, for this type of hybrid event, which was very low budget and very hands-on with all of us on board, what are some of the things that from a technical aspect, AV aspect, did you have to plan for to make this happen?
Before I go into that real quick, Vanu, one thing, that lab concept is really important. I want to share with everybody that I think as professionals in the meeting industry, most of us here are, try to get involved in a group like Resident Herd Meeting Planners or MPI so that you can test out some of these things in not quite as critical locations. As an organization, we get asked to sponsor many events, and actually, you know, it was hard to do that this past year, but every one we did, we learned something significant. And it was an opportunity for us to try something that maybe you wouldn't do with a client who says, I don't want to pay for that if you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So I was able to try some things. We discussed the Robo cam. That was actually something that came out of, necessity is the best invention. I was traveling light. I was with Catherine Gardette. We didn't bring a big team, so I was by myself. I'm like, well, I just should bring this Robo cam, and then I'm like, well, it was actually the perfect thing for the event because we could swing around and catch everybody. So I highly encourage that opportunity to do the lab, and I think these types of events are a good place to do it. Now, in terms of your question was, Vanu, what are the most important things? Well, if you're gonna go virtual, number one is obviously, besides coffee, is your internet line. So that internet bandwidth, not just the bandwidth, but what's the infrastructure, what's the networking system. So one thing that was a lifesaver is Vanu had actually taken down the number for the tech support of the hotel that wasn't necessarily on site. And that actually was something that helped us out significantly. So I want to pass that on as a tip is most hotels really don't manage their internet. They usually have a large internet-based company that supports all of the various network changes. So make sure you have that number. Vanu and I were on the phone with them at like 11 p.m. the night before. So
and that's a whole nother session just to talk about the internet capabilities, what to do and all of that. But definitely, and Brian, like you said, I would think, I'm thinking almost 99% of the venues I've worked with are not in control of their own internet. And you ask your CMS, tell me more about my internet. It's not as easy an answer. I'm hoping that as time goes, this becomes a better process for us all, but definitely start that process way in advance in those conversations. For this specific event, it was a third party that hosted the internet. And we talked about Wi-Fi versus hardwire internet. Gone are the days that venues have T1s, which I was a little surprised by, but and then also looking at where those lines are. Where is your Wi-Fi portal coming to? Where is your hardwires coming into? And then your AV supplier, are they prepared to how are they prepared to take that one line and then do a network. And I think that is pretty crucial because you can't always rely on a hotel, especially a third party provider for internet to provide all of those things. So Brian had quite a nice little network system going on back there.
Yeah, I think that's important, is to know that not only is it the bandwidth, it's the network backbone, it's your own network that you build out, and you have to ask a lot of questions. You need to have the right team members that can ask those questions. Having a planner like Vanu or Rebecca to get things started, that you knew where to start, but then I'm going to take it another level, and then we're going to talk to some additional people. And so you want to ask a lot of questions, and that's the key. I actually want to bring up something I meant that Phil talked about earlier, and I think the key is never to assume that your definition of any one word is the same. So Phil likes to ask a lot of questions. And I think it's important that you ask clarifying questions. Okay, so you have a wired internet connection. Okay, well, tell me more about it. Where is that wired jack? And are you in control of it? And how much bandwidth is allocated to that jack? And am I sharing it with the sleeping rooms? And, so you can't dig far enough to find out. You will always find something more to the mix, and so you just have to do your due diligence.
And you have to really trust and know your partner to ask those questions, because I know just enough to get myself in trouble, and I need those partners like Brian to steer me in the right direction.
And also, it never fails. We've all been there where we've asked all the questions. We think we have the game plan and we know what's going to happen. But always be prepared for that last minute, that person on site that's bringing you that Wi-Fi code or that hardwire doesn't know what's happening. So just being able to have, again, back to that core, who set that up, getting with them on 24-hour access for help desk, and just getting that help rather than waiting moments before your session starts, doing that as far in advance, if not at least a day in advance. I definitely highly recommend that. But that's great. Internet is one of my biggest advices I wish I can control more of. But what else, Brian? Anything else from an AV standpoint? Let's get past the internet. Talk. You did this really. Phil called it the Robo cam. That was it became quite the conversation at summer camp. What is it called, and why is it so awesome?
Okay, so actually the technical term is PTZ camera, and I should know what PTZ stands for, but I think it's the axes that the camera turns on. But that would be what you would ask for if you're out talking to your provider. Do you have any PTZ cameras? And you want to ask them further questions about what the resolution is and some other factors. But what's really great about that is I have a joystick. It's like I'm playing a video game, and I can just dial that camera in around the room. The other great feature is they have presets as well. So you may have noticed Brian's really fast focusing that camera. Well, no, I had a preset for the main stage. I had a preset for a certain quadrant of the ballroom. And so that's what really makes them very fun and very reliable, in the sense is you can get certain shots that you would not be able to get with a regular camera. A lot of them are very lightweight. And so if we were doing a bigger production, I might have flown that camera off the ceiling. And so then I would have really unobstructed views to get around to just about anywhere in the room. We did a simple setup. It was actually on a speaker stand in the back of the room, just sitting right next to the tech table. And we were able to cover probably 90% of the people in the room very effectively. And so if I would have brought two, I probably could have covered 100% of the room with no problem whatsoever. So
I was going to say, which made it effective, because if there were during the Q&As, when there are people in the audience talking or responding to a query or question from the speaker or presenter, that way people virtually, it was for the virtual audience. We wanted to make sure that when someone had a microphone in the back of the ballroom, that Brian was able to turn that camera and zoom in on that person, so that it's not, everyone knows how it is when you're in an audience and you can't even hear what the question was, in the audience. So in this environment, we were able to do both. We were able to have the microphone for anyone who is posing a question, and getting them on camera for the benefit of our digital audience.
You know
Phil
what
Again-
else I also liked, sorry, Rebecca, just really quick, when speaking about the microphone, you know, sometimes you can't hear what the question is, whether you have a microphone or not. Rebecca, you did such a great job of making sure that the questions were asked again, so the virtual audience definitely could hear that and weren't left out. So being cognizant of that and making, you know, just having that conversation with your facilitators and speakers to let them know, you know, we do have this situation where we have a virtual audience who may or may not be hear everything. So repeating the questions or the answers is really helpful.
And I think this sort of also goes back to what kind of meeting are you having? Like, this was intended to be very casual, very, you know, integrated. We wanted as much information from every audience member as we did from every speaker. This was not the Rebecca Takemoto show. Like, I didn't need to stand there and, you know, preach. We really were trying to involve everyone. And so having the screen show the gallery view of those that were listening, and having the RoboCam show, so that it really was like we were in the same room. I think that is super important. But at the same time, you know, I have some government meetings or meetings that have a lot of government officials that it would not be appropriate to do what we're talking about here. You know, we did things like, I was standing at the stage and yeah, I'd repeat the question, then I'd be like, Vanu, in the back of the room, does anybody have anything to say? You know, and that was totally fine because it was appropriate to this meeting. At the meeting I'm doing next week with the, you know, Secretary of the Interior, not so much. Like, I probably wouldn't do it the same way. So I think knowing your audience, knowing the goals of your meeting, knowing how you need and how much you need the virtual audience to integrate, or is it really just that you need to capture the information for those people that can't attend? Like, that's also important and super valid. Like, it doesn't have to be this integrated thing, because that doesn't work with every audience.
Right. And that goes to not always, you know, we talk so much about when we're planning these meetings about the run of show, who's on stage, what do they say, what's on screen. You have to almost also create another column, as we did with our planning documents, create another column of what's happening virtually as well. What's happening, what are they seeing, what are they hearing? Does it make sense for them to be involved? And also, you know, with the content, when you're in person, we have the luxury of getting up, having breaks, going for coffee, having lunch and all of that, and moving around. When we're doing a virtual environment, that's a lot of sitting. That's a lot of sitting for a period of time. And I know Phil and Rebecca, you guys thought a lot about that, about how much time are people sitting in their seats, not only for the virtual people, but for the people in person as well. Phil, can you talk a little bit about what went into that?
Sure. Well, real quickly, Vanu, you and your team deserve a lot of kudos for the structure that enabled the three of us here and others to work on that run of show. And we worked on it, it was down to the minute. Like, we really looked at it at, you know, like a program should be done. And we were cognizant of that. So taking a step back, yeah, I mean, look, streaming everything is, I think, maybe we would all agree, and everyone in the audience would be like, that wouldn't be the optimal solution. It's kind of the easy way out. Like, here it is. And so if you happen to click on your link, you'll see what's going on in person. That's really not what we intended to do. And most of the conversations I'm having with clients they feel the same way. So it's not Netflix. This is not Netflix, but it is appointment viewing. This is appointment viewing. So you want to look at your program down to the minute, down to the half hour, quarter hour, and make a conscious decision of what you can expect people to do. They won't sit, none of us would. We can talk about Zoom fatigue after 18 months, 19 months, but no one's going to sit at their computer for hours or 8 hours, let alone 4 hours on end. So it's a challenge. Do you intentionally put breaks in there? Just say, you know what? There's no streaming right now for the half hour. We're giving everyone a half hour or an hour or whatever it is, a break. And so it is appointment viewing, and it's important that you're delivering, you're really thinking through about what you're doing. Also, are you catering to specific segments? Some of those in the audience might have different segments with their members or attendees. And so are you establishing some breakout rooms so people can actually meet and gather and talk about topics and issues that are specific to them, not just lumping everybody virtually in one room? So it's really drilling down on, okay, we can't all be together in person, but what can we do to make this more of a community effort where people will, in some cases, they will buy, right? They're buying a registration to participate virtually. So how do we make this the best, non-in-person experience where they will feel they'll feel a part of what's going on in the in-person space, but they'll also perhaps be given some content that only they're doing. I'm working real quickly. I'm working on a particular hybrid where we're streaming general sessions, and in between is a networking experience for the virtual audience. Well, that's another hour. And so the questions that we're going through right now is, how do we explain that to them? How do we get them? Look, they're going to go to the bathroom. They're going to go to the fridge. They need to take the dog out. They need to get a walk in themselves, right? So how do we walk them through this experience? Do we record a video? Maybe we do a live thing and just kind of repeat it a couple times. So it's helping people navigate through that experience is really, really key.
And that's, somebody had put in the chat earlier how important it is to have a virtual moderator. That's where that comes in.
Right.
Having somebody that's like your MC for virtual attendees is super important. And I love that you use that term, appointment viewing. I've been using it. Maybe I got it from you. Just recently, I was talking with another conference that I'm just starting to work on that is kind of crazy. They have 1,200 speakers. It's a scientific conference. And so they're all like, 10 minutes or whatever, and they do, 25 at a time, but they're trying to figure out how to do a hybrid, portion of this. And I just said, the idea of putting together a platform with 1,200 speakers makes me want to throw up. Like, I'm not doing that. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to look through that kind of program. That does not, that does not work. So for that program, we are pre-recording every single speaker, whether they are in person or remote. They are all pre-recording. About 500 of the 1,200 are only virtual, so only available on demand or, through the platform in whatever way. The others are going to be there in person, but we're not streaming. They are pre-recording before they ever get to Florida. And we're streaming the plenaries, and then we're having basically appointment viewing for a small segment of these 1,200 talks at the beginning and the end of each day. This is a huge international audience. That's mostly who's going to be virtual. And so looking at time frames, it works to do it, 9 a.m., 9 p.m. sort of gets people at most parts of the world. And then we're having, even though we're going to be showing the pre-recorded, videos, those speakers that we're identifying as appointment viewing are going to be available for live Q&A. And so that's kind of how our, real interaction part of it is coming in. And it's kind of an interesting project.
This is a conversation that we could keep going, talking about different models, different ideas, different things that we're seeing out there. It truly is. And I really encourage everyone that's joining us today to reach out to Brian, Phil, Rebecca, or I, and just kind of have that conversation and keep it going. Go to these industry events where we're testing these things out, talking about these things, It's really a peer-led industry, which I absolutely love, because it's one that everyone seems to love to share and learn from each other. So definitely encourage that. Now, we have run out of time, and in our last words of wisdom that I'm going to ask from all of you, one of the things I want you to talk about is a little bit about, talk about your philosophy on the pricing between virtual and in-person and hybrid. And then also one last couple of words of wisdom that you can share with everyone going forward and planning their hybrid meeting. Rebecca?
So pricing wise, in general, most of my clients, the pricing is the same. And I think the philosophy behind that is that it's a big cost to go to a conference, and they get, they do get some extra things. We usually try to have some kind of hands-on or workshop-y kind of content that happens only on site, but then the content itself is the same virtually, and they're saving money by not going. Now, again, that's not the case with every organization. It's not how every audience works, but that's sort of been my rule of thumb. And I would just say, my general words of wisdom is plan with intention, not reaction.
Great. How about you, Brian?
I don't think I'm necessarily in the right spot to say I have the right answer on pricing, but I've typically been seeing that in person generally is a touch higher. Maybe more cost for deliverables for food or infrastructure related to that. But at the end of the day, I think the hybrid element or the virtual elements add just as much cost. So as Rebecca mentioned, the values there. I think the key with that is that you define the value of what you're getting with your registration price, so that everybody knows what they're getting for their money. My tip for you is to take an inventory. We all are very experienced. There's nobody more experienced than anybody right now. So take an inventory of what you know and be confident about that. Take some chances, push into the future. And this is going to be a great time for us. So trust yourself and move forward. Enjoy the hybrid.
Great. And Phil, what do you have to share with us? You always have some great thoughts for us to take away and ponder.
Well, thanks. I mean, I actually do a lot of listening. I'm listening to a lot of podcasts, reading as much as I can, just aside from just doing the work, right? So I'm not really an expert on the pricing aspect, but I'll leave folks with kind of these three things that have come to my mind while we're talking. One is get board. I call it boardroom buy-in. In other words, are the leaders of your, and I'm not telling, this is one thing I'm sure everyone knows, and I'm not telling you something you don't know, but I just want to emphasize that. Are the leaders of your organization embracing and leading into the format, whatever you decide to do, they need to be all in. I know it's easier said than done, but they have to, because all the participants are taking their cues from the leaders of the organization, from the executive director and the board members on down. Second is find evangelists. Use people who love you in terms of their members, their attendees, their participants. They could be sponsors. You might be seeing them every single year in person. These people will do things for you out of the goodness of their heart because they believe in your mission. And so leverage those evangelists. Pull them aside before the meeting. And you're not asking them to be a shill in the audience, but you're saying, can you watch my back? Can you encourage people to find their resources here? You want people to, because evangelists will help sell the format as better than you can. So it's important to really have them by your side as well. And the final thing is about forgiveness and vulnerability. Forgiveness is forgive yourself. We're all under pressure to deliver a great experience, but you've got to take a deep breath, take a step back, forgive yourself, and know that you might trip and stumble and all that, but it's all for the greater good. And that ties into vulnerability. So I'm probably the last to the party for Brene Brown. Some of you might know Brene. She's a speaker, a TED Talk speaker, an author. She's based in Houston. And she talks about vulnerability. Vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is embracing the fact that you don't know everything and leaning on others like partners to help you get to the finish line. And she feels that vulnerability is one of the tenets of good leadership. And so that's how I'll wrap up my comments, is that be vulnerable. It's a good thing. Accept it. Be forgiving, and find partners, evangelists and professional partners to help you succeed, because they will.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you, Brian and Rebecca. This has really been great. We honestly could go on and on talking about this, and you'll see us around and about at different events and virtual events and learning as much as we do sharing. So really appreciate it. You can, like I said before, definitely reach out to us. You can reach Brian at Prestige AV, and Phil with VirlyBird, and Rebecca with Syncopate. Stories to tell, lessons to share. So happy that you guys could join us today. Thank you, guys. It was great to see you after summer camp and to kind of debrief in a way and sharing the story with others. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. We really appreciate you joining us, and we'll make sure you get a copy of this recording and everyone's contact information so the sharing and love can continue. Enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. Bye-bye.